For nearly 2,000 years, millions of people have traveled to Jerusalem to visit the tomb of Jesus, believing they were standing at one of the most sacred places in human history. But there is a paradox that few people ever notice. Almost no one truly knows what lies beneath their feet. The ground beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is protected not only by stone and ancient walls, but by faith, tradition, and the fear of conflict that has lasted for centuries. It is so sacred that no one dared to disturb it, and because of that, it became a place where countless mysteries were left hidden. That changed when the ground began to sink. For the first time, history was forced to open. Modern technology was brought in, cutting through layers of Roman destruction, forgotten ancient quarries, and early Jewish tombs, revealing a story that had never been fully told. Stay with us until the end of this video, because what is uncovered will lead from one surprise to the next. The tomb believed to belong to Jesus is not a grand monument carved into open rock, but a small and tightly enclosed space hidden inside layers of later construction. At the center of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb sits inside a marble shrine known as the edicule, a structure built to protect what remains of a first-century rock-cut burial chamber. Unlike royal tombs or public mausoleums, this burial place is modest in scale, designed for speed and necessity rather than display. Its original form followed common Jewish burial customs of the time, with a carved stone bench where a body would be placed shortly after death. There are no inscriptions that name the person buried there, no symbols meant to declare identity, and no decoration meant to preserve memory. This simplicity is one reason the site has remained so controversial for centuries. The tomb does not prove anything by itself, yet it also does not contradict the historical context in which Jesus lived. What makes this tomb truly different is not its shape, but what happened around it afterward. Within just a few centuries, layers of Roman destruction, imperial rebuilding, and Christian construction completely transformed the original landscape. The burial chamber that once stood in an open quarry area outside the city walls was slowly enclosed, reinforced, and hidden inside one of the most complex religious buildings on Earth. As a result, the tomb became untouchable, not because of what it physically was, but because of what it came to represent. For nearly 2,000 years, no one was allowed to examine the ground beneath it in any meaningful way. Not because of a lack of curiosity, but because touching the site risked igniting conflict between religious authorities who shared control. That long protection created an unusual situation. The tomb survived wars, fires, earthquakes, and political upheaval, yet it was never studied with modern tools. Its physical condition was assumed rather than measured. That assumption began to fail in the early 21st century. Engineers working inside the church noticed that the marble pavement surrounding the edicule was no longer stable. Careful measurements showed that parts of the floor were slowly sinking under the immense weight of the structure above. This was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual shift caused by centuries of construction pressing down on uneven ground. At the same time, several stone columns supporting the shrine began to drift slightly out of alignment. The change was small, but in a confined space visited by thousands of people every day, even small shifts mattered. Experts warned that ignoring these signs could lead to structural failure with serious consequences for visitors. At that point, the issue stopped being symbolic and became practical. This was no longer about faith or tradition, but about safety. What followed was not a request to excavate history, but a demand to prevent disaster. That distinction changed everything. Under the long-standing status quo agreement, every Christian denomination controlling the site has veto power over major changes. In the past, even minor repairs had triggered decades of disagreement, but this time, delay meant real risk. Closing the tomb entirely was considered, but rejected because of its global religious impact. In the end, there were only two choices: allow limited scientific access under strict supervision or accept the possibility of collapse. Reluctantly, all parties agreed. Science was allowed to approach the tomb, not to search for proof, but to stabilize the structure. The conditions were clear from the beginning. Access would be brief. The area would be small. Every step would be watched. Nothing would be disturbed unless absolutely necessary. This was not an open investigation, but a controlled intervention. Yet for the first time in modern history, instruments were placed near a surface that had been sealed for generations. And once science was allowed to look beneath the stone, even for safety reasons, it raised a question that could no longer be avoided. If the tomb itself had survived untouched for centuries, what kind of history had been quietly preserved beneath it? The moment scientists were allowed inside, they quickly realized this was not a normal research site. This was a space shaped by limits, rules, and constant observation, where every movement mattered. Access was granted for a specific purpose, and nothing beyond that purpose was allowed. Time inside the working zone was tightly controlled, measured in short windows rather than open schedules. The area itself was extremely small, limited to the space directly surrounding the edicole. There was no freedom to explore outward or downward without approval. Every step taken by engineers and specialists was monitored by representatives of the religious communities. This presence was not symbolic, but active. Observers watched each tool, each scan, and each adjustment in real time. The goal was clear from the beginning. Science was not there to answer spiritual questions or confirm tradition. It was there to understand structure, materials, and risk. That purpose shaped every decision that followed. Because physical disturbance was unacceptable, the team relied on technologies designed to see without breaking. The first and most important tool was ground-penetrating radar. By sending electromagnetic signals into the floor, GPR allowed scientists to read what lay beneath the stone without removing a single slab. The results appeared as layered patterns, showing changes in density and shape below the surface. These readings helped identify voids, slopes, and inconsistencies that could threaten stability. At the same time, laser scanning was used to document the visible structure in extreme detail. Every stone around the edicule was digitally recorded. The scans captured angles, distances, and surface changes measured down to millimeters. This created a precise three-dimensional record of the shrine as it existed before intervention. If anything shifted later, scientists would know exactly when and how it happened. Another critical method involved the analysis of mortar and binding material. Tiny samples were examined to understand how different construction phases fit together. This helped engineers distinguish between original stone, later repairs, and modern reinforcements. Knowing which layers carried weight and which were decorative was essential for safety planning. Throughout this process, one rule remained constant. Nothing was interpreted beyond what the data showed. There was no attempt to link measurements to identity, belief, or theology. The focus stayed on physical evidence and material history. This discipline mattered because the environment itself demanded restraint. Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, even neutral actions carry symbolic weight. By keeping the work technical and limited, the team avoided triggering larger disputes. Still, the data began to hint at something unexpected. The radar patterns did not show a flat, uniform base beneath the floor. Instead, they revealed uneven layers shaped by different uses over time. Some sections reflected deliberate construction. Others suggested older activity that predated the church entirely. At this stage, no conclusions were announced. The information was recorded, verified, and stored, but the implication was impossible to ignore. The ground beneath the shrine was not a single foundation, but a stacked record of human activity. What began as a safety inspection was slowly becoming a map of buried history. Yet the team did not rush forward. They understood that crossing from stabilization into interpretation required caution. Every scan, every measurement suggested that the floor was not resting on a single moment in time, but on multiple human stories layered one above another. This was no longer just about keeping stone from collapsing. It was about realizing that the structure stood on a compressed archive of Jerusalem itself. At that point, science did not push deeper with tools. It moved forward by reading what was already visible in the data. Because once the modern repairs were mapped and the safety risks understood, the next step became unavoidable. To understand why the ground behaved this way, scientists had to follow the layers downward, and that is where the floor stopped being a surface and started becoming a timeline. What the scans revealed next changed how the entire site was understood. The ground beneath the church was not a single foundation, but a vertical record of history built layer by layer. Each level represented a different moment when the land was reshaped, reused, or deliberately altered. At the top sat the most recent layers, formed during restorations in the 19th and 20th centuries. These included leveling mortar and support material added to stabilize the shrine for modern pilgrims. They were practical, uneven, and clearly designed to solve immediate problems rather than preserve the past. Beneath them appeared a far more deliberate surface from the 4th century. This was the Byzantine layer, connected to the massive rebuilding ordered under Emperor Constantine. Stone fragments and paving patterns showed a planned sanctuary rather than temporary repair. This layer mattered because it confirmed that the site had already become monumental early in Christian history. Below that, the character of the ground changed sharply. The next layer was Roman fill from the 2nd century, dense and uniform. It showed signs of intentional leveling rather than natural collapse. Historians associate this material with Roman efforts to erase earlier use of the area. Structures were flattened, debris was compacted, and memory was buried under stone. This was not decay, it was policy. What made this discovery powerful was not the presence of Roman material, but how intact it remained. The layers were not mixed or disturbed. Each one sat cleanly above the next. That separation allowed scientists to read the sequence with confidence. It meant centuries of construction had not destroyed what came before. Instead, the ground preserved it like pages in a closed book. As the data reached deeper, religious markers disappeared entirely. There were no symbols, no inscriptions, and no architectural decoration. What emerged instead was evidence of everyday urban life from ancient Jerusalem. The soil composition shifted. Stone chips, fine limestone dust, and sloping cuts began to dominate the scans. These were not signs of temples or shrines. They pointed to something far more ordinary. This area had once been an active limestone quarry. That realization reframed everything above it. The church was not built on untouched ground. It stood on land that had already lived several lives, first as a working industrial zone, later as a place reshaped by burial practices, then as a site transformed by belief and power. The importance of this stratigraphy was simple but profound. It showed that history here was continuous, not symbolic. Nothing had been invented later to fit a story. The ground itself carried the sequence forward, and once the quarry layer was identified, the next step became clear. To understand why this place became a burial site at all, scientists had to step fully into the world of 1st century Jerusalem. Once the quarry layer was clearly identified, the story beneath the church began to align with what historians know about how ancient Jerusalem actually functioned. The markings in the stone were not random damage or natural erosion, but clear traces of organized limestone extraction that followed techniques used widely in the 1st century. Cut lines ran in consistent directions, sloped surfaces followed the natural grain of the bedrock, and the compacted dust left behind showed long-term industrial use rather than short bursts of activity. Limestone was the backbone of Jerusalem's growth because it was abundant, easy to shape, and strong enough to support large buildings, which made quarry zones common along the outer edges of the city. As construction expanded and resources were exhausted, many of these quarries were abandoned, leaving behind open rock faces and hollowed ground that no longer served economic needs. At that point, Jewish burial law quietly reshaped their purpose. Under Jewish tradition, burial within the city walls was forbidden because the presence of the dead was considered ritually impure for living spaces. This rule pushed tomb construction beyond the walls, into areas that were close enough for family access but separate from daily life. Abandoned quarries fit this need almost perfectly because they already lay outside the city boundary, offered exposed rock for carving, and required no disruption to homes or markets. Archaeological surveys around Jerusalem repeatedly show this pattern, where former industrial zones were reused as burial grounds once their economic value ended. The location beneath the church follows this same logic step by step. The slope of the terrain matches reconstructions of the city's first-century limits, placing the site clearly beyond the inhabited core. The quarry cuts align with other known extraction areas dated to the same period, which strengthens the conclusion that this land was never intended as a central or ceremonial space. What later generations saw as a sacred center began as a functional edge. This context matters because it removes the need for symbolic explanation. The land was not chosen because of spiritual meaning, but because it was available, legal, and practical within the rules of the time. Only later did memory and tradition attach significance to what was originally an ordinary burial environment. This also explains how tombs could exist beneath later monumental construction without contradiction. As Jerusalem expanded, city walls shifted outward, enclosing areas that had once been peripheral. Burial sites did not move, but the city grew around them. The original use remained preserved underground, while new meanings were built above it. Seen this way, the site beneath the church reflects urban development rather than exception. It follows known laws, known customs, and known geography without requiring belief to fill the gaps. And once the quarry context is understood, the next step becomes unavoidable. If this space was reused according to standard Jewish burial practice, then the tomb structures carved into it should reflect the design rules of the period. That transition from landscape to architecture is where the evidence becomes even more specific. Once researchers moved beyond the surrounding terrain and focused directly on the carved chamber itself, the tomb began to provide clearer and more grounded clues about its origin, its purpose, and the people who shaped it. The space was not a natural hollow formed by erosion, but a deliberately carved burial chamber cut into limestone using techniques that were common among Jewish communities in Jerusalem during the 1st century. Along the interior walls, stone benches were carved at a uniform height, positioned carefully to support a body during the earliest stage of burial rites, when washing, anointing, and wrapping would take place according to established custom. These benches were shaped with practical intent rather than ceremony, showing smooth working surfaces that balanced speed with care, which suggests the tomb was prepared for real use rather than symbolic display. Deeper into the chamber, narrow burial niches were cut directly into the bedrock, intended to receive the body after the initial preparation period, following a process well documented in other Jewish tombs from the same era. The coexistence of benches and niches within a single chamber strongly points to a family tomb, since single-use burials from this period rarely included such complete arrangements. Equally revealing was the quality of the stonework itself, because the tool marks showed steady pressure, repeated strokes, and consistent angles that reflected the work of experienced craftsmen rather than hurried or untrained labor. There were no signs that the chamber had been expanded, reshaped, or repaired in later centuries, which suggests it was carved in a single phase and then left largely undisturbed. When archaeologists compared this structure to other first-century Jewish tombs found across Jerusalem, the parallels were difficult to ignore, since the size, layout, and carving style matched examples already dated with confidence. One partially carved niche stood out in particular because the work appeared to stop abruptly, a detail often associated with tombs that were pressed into use sooner than planned due to an unexpected death. Just as important as what was present was what was absent. There were no crosses, no inscriptions, no decorative symbols, and no architectural changes that could be linked to later Christian use or medieval modification. Nothing in the stone suggested an attempt to reshape the space to match evolving religious meaning. Instead, the tomb remained fixed in its original cultural and historical context, reflecting burial customs rather than belief systems. This distinction places a clear limit on what the structure alone can prove. The architecture confirms the period and the burial tradition with strong consistency, but it cannot identify the individual who was laid there. Stone records behavior, not names. The tomb supports historical possibility rather than certainty, grounding tradition in physical context without turning it into proof. And it is precisely this balance between alignment and uncertainty that explains why memory became so important later, because when architecture stops short of answers, tradition often steps in to fill the silence. The story of how this tomb became central to Christian belief does not begin with archaeology, but with power, memory, and a decision made in the 4th century. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, he ordered the removal of a Roman temple dedicated to Venus that stood over this area, a structure deliberately placed there during earlier imperial rule. Roman sources suggest this was not accidental, but part of a wider effort to suppress Christian sites by covering them with pagan monuments. Once the temple was dismantled, Constantine authorized a large-scale excavation and the construction of a church, marking the spot that local Christians had long associated with the burial of Jesus. This action did not rely on written maps or physical proof in the modern sense, but on what historians call collective memory. For generations, Christian communities in Jerusalem had passed down the location through oral tradition, private gatherings, and discreet pilgrimage, even during periods of persecution. This memory survived not because it was recorded, but because it was repeated, protected, and tied to shared identity. Scholars continue to debate how reliable such memory can be, especially when centuries pass without documentation. Some argue that oral tradition can drift or reshape itself over time. Others point out that sacred geography often remains surprisingly stable, especially when communities return to the same place despite danger. What matters here is that Constantine did not invent the site, but responded to an existing belief that already carried weight among local Christians. The church he built formalized that memory, turning a quietly remembered place into a public monument. From that moment on, tradition became architecture, and belief became stone. Yet even then, the boundary remained clear. Faith explained why the site mattered. History could only explain why it was possible. What was revealed beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not an isolated moment, but part of a wider shift in how modern science is changing our relationship with the past by allowing history to be studied without being torn apart. For most of the last 2 centuries, archaeology depended on excavation, which meant that learning more often required breaking walls, removing floors, and permanently altering the very sites scholars wanted to protect. Today, that approach is being replaced by technologies that can see through stone, soil, and forest cover, giving researchers access to information that once seemed unreachable. A clear example of this transformation can be seen at the Great Pyramid of Giza, a monument that had been measured and explored for generations and was widely believed to hold no major secrets.
By using muon tomography, scientists tracked cosmic particles as they passed naturally through the pyramid, creating a detailed internal image that revealed a large hidden void without cutting into a single block of stone. This discovery did not damage the structure or challenge its cultural meaning, but it forced experts to rethink long-held assumptions about how the pyramid was designed and constructed. In Italy, the ruins of Pompeii show how technology can restore human stories to places long reduced to silent remains. High-resolution laser scanning has allowed archaeologists to document entire neighborhoods with extreme precision, while DNA analysis and CT scans of plaster casts have revealed the age, health conditions, and family relationships of people who died in the eruption. As a result, Pompeii is no longer seen only as a frozen disaster, but as a living city whose residents now have identities rather than shapes. A similar shift occurred at Machu Picchu, a site often described as mystical or symbolic because of its dramatic mountain setting. Geological surveys combined with LiDAR mapping showed that the Inca deliberately built the city along fault lines, using natural fractures in the rock to manage water flow and reduce earthquake damage, which revealed careful engineering rather than coincidence. In Southeast Asia, the temples of Angkor were once thought to be isolated monuments swallowed by jungle, until LiDAR scans exposed an enormous network of canals, roads, and residential zones hidden beneath the forest canopy. This discovery transformed Angkor from a religious center into evidence of one of the largest pre-industrial cities ever built. All of these cases point to the same conclusion: the past has not changed, but our ability to see it has. What lies beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre belongs to this global pattern, where technology does not replace belief or tradition, but gives history a clearer structure by turning what was once speculation into physical context. What modern technology revealed beneath the tomb was not a single shocking object, but a layered truth built slowly through stone, soil, and time. Science did not uncover proof of faith, nor did it try to challenge belief, but it exposed the physical history hidden under centuries of tradition, showing a Roman destruction layer, an abandoned limestone quarry, and a 1st century Jewish tomb shaped by real burial customs. These findings place the site firmly within the geography, law, and daily life of ancient Jerusalem, rather than legend alone. Ground scanning, material analysis, and structural mapping allowed researchers to read what could never be written down. The result is not a final answer, but something more powerful, a place where history, memory, and belief now stand on clearer ground than ever before.